Good morning, everyone. And on behalf of the National Steering Committee, thank you all for joining us for the first SEGRA webinar for 2021. In our webinar series, we look at key issues affecting regional Australia from a range of integrated perspectives. So we look at policy, economic, social and governance. And it's appropriate that we are starting the year looking at the key strategic directions for regional Australia for 2021. We're certainly looking forward to our series of webinars this year, and they'll include a variety of viewpoints and of course, as SEGRA's noted, for practical ideas. Unfortunately, our format doesn't allow us to direct participation from registrants, but can I strongly encourage you to use the chat box and Q&A, and we'll try to get to any questions or comments. I'm also planning on putting out a special communique about the discussion at today's meeting, and so if you want to email me, my email's on the screen. I'm more than happy to take on board your ideas and your suggestions, and we've certainly had a number prior to today's webinar, so thanks very much to people. Most particularly, we're looking forward to our face-to-face meeting for the first time in 2 years, and that will be in Calgary, Boulder on the 16th to the 18th of November. Now, many of our speakers from last year's webinars will be in attendance, so that will be an opportunity, a further opportunity for you to talk face-to-face with people. Well, let's get started. Firstly, welcome to the National Steering Committee, who you can see on the screen, and I will introduce them as they come to speak. But we do have members of the National Steering Committee from business, not-for-profit, government, and from across Australia. And I'm pleased to have Rolf, who's lives in Alice Springs and has worked in Indigenous communities for a long time. So in preparing for this morning's session, we grouped our thinking around 4 themes that we thought were the key strategic directions facing regional, rural and remote Australia. The first of these was the major projects that deliver our strategic priorities to make sure we maximise value for money and regional socio-economic objectives. The second one, which we're strongly committed to, is that it's locally driven and that there's social and economic innovation. Third topic that we identified as a key issue facing regional, rural and remote Australia was service access. And of course, we're in a COVID period at the moment, so there's been some learnings there. And the final topic that we're going to talk about is the capacity to respond to opportunity and unforeseen priorities. So let's turn to the first of these 3 and these 4. What sort of strategic thinking is important for the delivery of major projects to ensure that we're meeting strategic priorities to maximise value for money and regional socio-economic objectives? And I'd like to welcome Dr. Jen Cleary to start a conversation. Jen, as you can see from her background, is with Centrecare Catholic Country South Australia. Jen is actually the CEO of that organisation, which is a social service agency providing services across rural, regional and remote South Australia. Jen has also had a substantial career in academia and has a deep understanding of community empowerment as part of her work in regional, rural and remote Australia. So welcome, Jen. And can I ask you to talk a bit about some of the important considerations in infrastructure policy for regional, rural and remote Australia?
Thanks very much, Kate. And I'm thrilled to be here, having just made it and struggling with my own infrastructure issue, which was that our office in Whyalla, where I was this morning, the internet went down, as often happens in regional, rural and especially remote Australia. So the internet went down and I had to make a mad dash for Port Augusta, which is 80 kilometres north of there. I managed to make it with 1 minute to spare. So if I appear a bit flustered, that's the reason. But thank you, and thanks to my colleagues who are also on board, and for everybody who's attending today.
I can see Kate.
One of the things that really strikes me about infrastructure policy, and particularly those major infrastructure projects.
All right, hang us.
That
what's your email?
Sorry, there's someone talking in the background. If you could mute your microphone, that would be helpful. Thank you.
AD. Was it AB or AD? Yep.
Kate, you have capacity to mute that microphone.
Mm-hmm. At.
So if you go to participants, you should be able to mute that.
Okay, thanks. I'll do that.
Okay. So in terms of major infrastructure projects, which are those things that tend to be rolled out, particularly when there's some sort of national emergency, and as we have seen during the pandemic, as I guess an economic stimulus, and always a very good idea. One of the challenges, of course, for regional, rural and remote Australia is that those projects quite often have a long lead in time in terms of the preparation that's needed to build a new bridge, for example. Often what we find is that that capacity and capability may not be readily available immediately in regional, rural and remote Australia. So those larger infrastructure projects, there will be a lag time. Now, when you couple that with the lag time that we know exists in regional, rural and remote Australia around things like a pandemic. So, sometimes we get this kind of bubble effect in terms of our local economies where they're semi-protected for a little while, and then 6 months to 8 to 10 months later, we'll see some of the real effects of that. We see the same thing in terms of trying to ramp up for national infrastructure projects. So one of the things that I've been thinking about is that quite often we know that there's a housing shortage, for example, in parts of our country, and particularly in those regional spaces. So I think we need to be broader in our thinking around infrastructure policy, and not thinking just about the really big once in a generation projects, but things like social housing, things like water infrastructure, and perhaps thinking about some of the environmental and social benefits of smaller projects and the capability that already exists in regional, rural and remote communities, because we know that there are builders, there are building companies, there are contractors, there are all of those skills that already exist in our regional, rural and remote communities for the most part. And it's much easier to go and build 10 houses than one bridge, because if you do want to build one bridge, for example, then you're going to have to bring people into the region, and then really you need to then consider, well, is all of that economic benefit staying in that region, or is there some leakage nationally? So that's the first point that I'd make. Secondly, in projects such as that, a lot of those jobs have traditionally been potentially male focused, and I don't want to sound sexist there. We certainly have tradies of both sexes. However, it has traditionally been a male-dominated field in terms of those infrastructure projects, and so I quite often wonder and worry about jobs for women in our communities. So I just think we need to shift our thinking a little bit in terms of infrastructure policy in relation to those major projects, and to consider perhaps some of the second and third tier projects like, as I said, social housing, water infrastructure, etc., that have fantastic benefits for our communities and for our populations, but are also easier to get up and running quickly and when needed. Thanks, Kate.
Thanks very much, Jen. And we're just waiting for Ashley Bland to join us. And Jen's already highlighted, and we're telling you nothing new about the issues of technology and the internet. And that's one of the things that I think has been a learning from COVID, is that you can use the internet, but that's not the case for a lot of regional Australia when you're relying on it. Now, Ash, are you there? Your photo's on the screen now.
Yes, no,
okay,
I'm
terrific,
here.
Ash. Well, lovely to have you with us. It seems, Ash, that we're hurtling along the path of technological change at gathering speed. And I just wondered if you could tell us a bit about where you see energy policy, production, distribution and ownership in the future.
Yeah, well, look, I think, thank you, Kate. I think we're at actually one of those points in time that we'll look back and go, oh my goodness, you know, we talked about all this radical change for decades, and then all of a sudden it just happened. And what you're seeing is an alignment of technology and the business case and the social case, you know, or the moral case, if you like. And when all three of those sort of drivers align, you get pretty rapid change. And I think, you know, it's fair to say now that, you know, our traditional forms of generating energy are no longer competitive, or on the cusp of being no longer competitive going forward. And that actually what's happening is of such a profound shift, because not only is it just technology, and I think we get caught up in solar panels and wind and arguments about where they should be, but actually it's back to the future for regional Australia. And I just want to take us back to, say, the 1950s, you know, well, even further than that, you know, in the 1880s, 1886, I think it was, when Tamworth had the nation's first electrical light grid. You know, then Tamworth ran that, and very soon other towns started. And you're looking at a period where the farms had their old Lister diesel or whatever it was creating energy. And they did that because they could control their own destiny, and it allowed them to be productive. Then we roll forward to the middle of last century after the wars, and it's like, don't worry about that, guys. All you towns that are struggling with your own energy grids don't need to anymore. The state government is going to look after that for you, and we're going to spend billions building poles and wires to ship the energy around. Then, for various reasons, that model sort of reached, you know, it's strained. All of our infrastructure's old, and in the interim, this technology's appeared that enables us to actually generate energy the way we used to, locally and at scale. And of course, any technological shift is actually a socio-economic shift as well. And what we've got happening now is the ability for small players in the market to re-emerge and be competitive. And so you're seeing a real breakdown of that, you know, the duopoly or 3 or 4 large companies, and you're seeing smaller regions actually able to participate in the energy markets as what they're calling prosumers. And the business cases for that are stacking up. You know, I'm not repeatedly doing this for lots of local governments, and I'm not seeing anything less than a 7% yield on investment. Plus, it has the advantage of being 100% renewable and getting ready for the carbon impact that most people see coming in at some stage or another. And as well as that, it's a massive economic tool for regional Australia. And you know, I was thinking about this morning. You know, in say the region I live, which is up around Central West New South Wales, in sort of Central West and a touch of Arana, we as residents and businesses spend $1 billion a year on energy. Now, at present, we buy all of that in from other places as petrochemicals and energy from burning coal somewhere, or wind farms somewhere else, owned by large companies. Now we can turn that around. And, you know, if we said, you know, if our federal member or state member stood up and said, listen, people of Bathurst and Orange, I'm going to give you $100 million a year just to let wash around your economies, you know, do what you like with it, we'd think the Messiah had arrived, you know, and that's just a fraction of the opportunity in this space. So, you know, one of the things I think we need to look at as a society more broadly is getting cognizant of what those social and economic impacts will be, and actually being deliberate around it, because we know that currently it's all big business led, other than a fringe sort of community energy projects. And I'd really like to see us as a sector for regional Australia grab hold of this and actually say, what are the benefits we want for regional Australia out of this transition that's happening anyway, whether we like it or not? We know governments have levers that they can pull, and how can we adjust the settings so that we maximise the impact of this once in a generation transformation for regional Australian centres where, in fact, the energy will be made. You know, you're not going to power the country from Redfern. It has to be from regional Australia.
Thanks very, very much, Ash. And Ash, as he's already indicated, is our New South Wales rep on the National Steering Committee, and he brings his extensive experience and knowledge to the sustainability component of every SEGRA. Ash is an environmental engineer and is also the Director of Constructive Energy, where he applies his skills, knowledge, networks and passion for environmental stewardship. And you're certainly someone who puts your money where your mouth is. So thanks very much for that, Ash. Of course, another key issue is telecommunications, but we're going to pick that up in our discussion about service access. We also are looking forward to hearing about Western Australian Government's strategic plan for regional economic development at SEGRA this year, which has recently been released and will be in our newsletter at the end of the month. In the interests of time, I'd like to move on to our second major strategic direction, which is locally driven social and economic innovation. This, as always, is a key action agenda at SEGRA 2021. And please, listeners today, think about the initiatives you're involved in and the value of sharing this with SEGRA delegates. If you're not on our mailing list to receive updates about the call for papers, please visit our website on the bottom of the screen and sign up. So two emerging trends that we are noticing is the increasing importance of co-ops and social enterprises. Rod, you have an excellent example from Sea Lake in Victoria. Can you tell us a bit about this?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Kate, and welcome everyone to the SEGRA panel today. Look, I think if we begin the discussion there with the fact that change happens in local communities because of action by local people. So it's what happens on the ground that will determine your future. So it's crucial you get the buy-in of people within your community or your region, depending on your circumstances, to make things happen. That's probably the golden rule of all of this and what we're talking about today. Obviously, COVID has driven a bit of I suppose, a challenging period for everyone, to say the least. But out of that as well, we've seen some terrific initiatives forced out of the necessity. And so, again, these are activities that local people have put in the efforts and ideas to create that change. So I'd just like to cover off a few today. And one in particular that Kate mentioned there was Sea Lake in Victoria, northwest, up in the Mallee of Victoria. They were probably typical of country towns right across Australia that had their, I guess, glory days and very prosperous times through various industries, sheep, wool, wheat, etc., various grains. What we saw in Sea Lake was a situation where the main town was starting to run down, the centre of the town. And a group of locals got together and had a look at what was happening. They had two pubs in the town. One had actually burnt down, one was closing down. Various shops were boarded up within the town. So they formed a group, and the first action out of that was they actually bought the local pub. And that was actually a consortium of 42 people who got together to do that, including one former resident who'd been living, I think it was in Sydney or Melbourne. He was very successful, but he wanted to see some activity in his local town and support where he grew up. So he also came in. They bought the hotel. They used local trades to do it up, spent over $500,000 fixing it up. And now it's open and actually trading extremely well. And it's well supported because there's a whole buy-in from the community. They built it, pulled it together, and it's an important meeting place for the town. That was a sort of I guess, a starting point for them, and they later moved on to the hardware store, where another group bought the hardware store. Farmers particularly had trouble buying things in town. That was identified as a real need. So a group got together and got that started, up and running, and now there's things are happening there. So out of this, there's another, I think at this point, around about another dozen jobs in the hotel. There's other jobs in the hardware store. So that's just two examples, and perhaps one that was driven by COVID was with the drought initially, but obviously later became important. Was Buy from the Bush. It was a campaign started by Grace Brennan back in October 2019 because of the drought and the lack of income within a lot of rural communities, and that was an online buying shop, if you like, and that's been extremely successful. So these are initiatives that people have had. Again, it's driven by local people in their community making a difference, and I think there's probably a lot of people out there who are listening today can add a town to it, but there's some that may be thinking, where can we go? And it just shows you that with some effort and thought, harnessing the local strengths of individuals can make a difference in your community.
Thanks, Rod. And we'd love to hear of other people's case studies in that space. Jen, I might just come back to you and ask if you could just speak briefly in regard to your experiences with social enterprises.
Thanks, Kate. Look, I think the pandemic itself has, there's been the whole notion of social entrepreneurship and social enterprise been around for a while. But sometimes it's not until you get that situation of needs must that drives some of that innovation. So Rod talked there, for example, about the drought being a bit of a catalyst for the Buy from the Bush campaign, and COVID itself has been a bit of a catalyst for some different forms of thinking, and perhaps that drilling down and thinking about our own resilience and our own self-reliance, and how do we actually harness those skills and talents of people in our communities. There's a very big social entrepreneurship and social innovation movement in the UK, for example, and I think that there's a lot that we can learn from that space, because they've been sort of tackling some of that stuff for a long time. It's thrilling to see it happening to such an extent in our regional, rural and remote Australian communities, and to see that can-do spirit really coming through. One of the things that I'd like to comment on in that space is, what are the things we need? So we know that, often it's a catalyst that will compel us to think about social entrepreneurship and social enterprises. But what are the things that you might need in your community to support that and to drive that? And, for example, is it the personalities of one or two people? I don't think so. But is it some level of leadership skill? Is it some other set of skills? And if there is something in that space that can be identified, then how do we make sure that we can make some of those skills transferable, and that we can build perhaps the capacity and capability of many more of our communities to be able to express their needs and provide their own response to that, so that we can see more. Because what you're talking about, Rod, they're fantastic examples of social enterprise, and I wonder why aren't we seeing more of that in other communities? And it would be fantastic to see that. The other thing is, picking up on some of what Ashley was saying around energy, etc. We can see that we're really in the death spiral of the current ways that we are both generating and transporting energy in our country. I really would love for us to think more about, well, when we have distributed power networks, and when we actually have social enterprise. And when we join those two things together, and we can start to think about communities themselves managing their own power, and communities, you know, I call, you know, it's a bit of a play on words, but actually empowering themselves, then you start to remove some of the transaction costs of getting product to market, etc. So you actually mitigate the distance issue of regional communities from the centre. Now that's enough from me because everybody else wants to go, but just a couple of ideas to chuck in there. Thanks, Kate.
Thanks, Jen. Well, I'd now like to introduce to you our newest member of the National Steering Committee, Professor Rolf Garretson. Rolf is currently a professorial research fellow at Charles Darwin University, but he's also worked as director of the Australian Centre for Regional and Local Government Studies and run his own research consultancy for a number of years. So he certainly straddles a wide range of occupational types. Between 2002 and 2006, Rolf was the Director of Social Economic Policy in the Chief Minister's Department in the Northern Territory. So Rolf, you have both a deep interest and knowledge of regional development with a focus on disadvantaged, remote and Indigenous areas. And if I could invite you now to talk of your observations about locally driven social and economic innovation in the communities you work in, and then perhaps that will segue into service access. So welcome, Rolf. You're on mute, Rolf.
Oops. Is that better?
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay. All of you will be aware of, if you like, the images and stories of deficit across northern and outback Australia. A lot of it centred on Indigenous people. And I want to briefly open my remarks by looking at the 5 factors that drive development in Northern Australia, Northern and remote Australia, and suggest some cautious optimism about them. Now, the 5 factors that, if you like, impede or have historically impeded outback development, northern development, have been transport costs. They are huge. I mean, for instance, in Boulder, a litre of diesel costs you 30 cents more, at least, than it does in Rockhampton. So we can see the economic disadvantages imposed by that. I'm cautiously optimistic about that. As part of the energy revolution, I think ultimately we will have electronic transport, which will lower the costs, though possibly not relatively. Energy costs, well, Ashley talked about that. There are very positive developments in Northern Australia. I mean, we saw over the last 20 years, we've seen the transition from diesel generated electricity to gas, which is slight progress. But as Ashley noted, I mean, I predict that within 10 years, all the remote communities in the Northern Territory will have point of consumption generation of electricity, which will reduce their costs massively and reduce some of the poverty that remote residents, particularly Indigenous ones, face as a result of it. Labour markets are very peculiar in the Northern Territory and in, say, Northern Western Australia and Western Queensland. This goes to some of the things that Jen and you have said earlier about opportunities. You know, the simple fact is that a lot of remote labour markets operate on a seasonal basis, as in, say, cattle and tourism. And I don't know if that's going to change much in the future. Communications, again, a huge problem. Someone mentioned earlier, you know, the poor internet, etc. I think that's changing. The possibilities are much greater, again, for each cattle station or each Aboriginal community to have better internet. There's a applied technology centre here in Alice that's invented a thing that looks like a pole. They're testing it in various laybys along the Stuart Highway, because the reality is, if you drive from Darwin to Adelaide, Alice Springs and Katherine are about the only places north of Port Augusta where you will get reliable access to telecommunications. but I'm confident that that will change. The final one, again, which is a bit like the labour markets, an intractable problem, is that North and remote Australia are effectively capital exporting regions. Now, that sounds paradoxically because nobody in these places is considered rich, but, you know, and we've just finished building an LNG plant off Darwin that cost 34 billion. It's a fair bit of capital pouring in, but it hasn't. Yes, because all the white fellas in northern and remote Australia, or a lot of the white fellas, intend to retire somewhere else, usually close to their grandchildren. And so they invest surplus cash, they invest in housing markets in places where they intend to retire. Their superannuation is invested elsewhere. So again, that's a problem. It's a problem of scale and a lack of local institutions. The financial sector is very strongly centralised in Australia, and that disadvantages people basically for each kilometre you're away from Melbourne or Sydney. So I'm relatively positive in parts about the future, particularly with regard to energy and the spin-offs that will have for economies in northern and remote Australia. And I want to suggest some opportunities. Now, the first one is aquaculture. Queensland has a thriving prawn agriculture industry, but the rest of the northern coast, apart from pearling off the Kimberley coast, has virtually nothing. Now, part of the problem is that 70% of the Northern Territory coastline is owned by Aboriginal groups, but work is starting on getting those groups to produce trepang or bêche de mer, which was a traditional commodity traded via the people from Bugis in Indonesia to China, which the White Australia policy stopped. But so there are seeds of growth there, so I can be optimistic. And the one particular industry I want to refer to, because it related to carbon capture, and that is the Savannah Burning initiatives. Now, in 2002, Inpex, which is a Japanese company, built a big LNG refinery in Darwin, nowhere near as the newest one, but nowhere near as big, sorry. And what they did was that they said, well, because the Territory government is very slack in negotiating with these big multinationals, so Inpex of its own volition said, we will pay $1 million a year for 20 years to mitigate the climate change effects of this LNG plant. And the Territory government, wisely, friends of mine basically organised this, decided to fund a group of rangers who operate out of Maningrida, which is on the north coast of Arnhem Land. And they started a project called Savannah Burning, and it was a cooperative project between traditional owners, the rangers as the workers, and Western scientists. And what they did was they burnt country, say in April or May. So they created fires, patchwork fires through the countryside that reduced the problem that we had in the Northern Territory of the build-up of dry matter, so that in the late dry season, in September or so, you have these huge bushfires. I mean, on a scale, we had one 2 years ago here near Alice. It was about 800 kilometres long. These bushfires didn't get on the national map, but they were contributing about 5% of our carbon emissions. So what they do is there's a satellite that observes and takes photos, passes over Northern Australia once a day, takes photos, and you can analyse the amount of cover, so grass and other matter. And so when it's burnt, you can compare what the greenhouse gas emissions you issue in May with what greenhouse gas emissions would have be created by bushfires in September. That huge carbon saving can be sold on the international market as a carbon credit. Since the original project, there are now from my memory, about 20 such projects across the northern savannas in Queensland and to a lesser degree, but fairly thick on the ground, if you like, in the Northern Territory and less so in the Kimberleys. These projects generate about $90 million a year currently in carbon credit revenue. And you compare that, say, with the Northern Territory cattle industry, which is, say, 4 times as big, but the carbon sequestration and controlled burning has a potential, I think, of a market of about 500 million. So there are, if you like, innovative solutions for remote and northern Australia. And as Ashley said, there's this sort of perfect conjunction that is occurring, and these developments will occur very rapidly. And the great advantage of them is that they will be driven at a low scale, so local scale, and apply local initiative.
Thanks, Rolf. That was terrific to get a sense of the opportunities in remote communities and to represent the Northern Territory there. If I could just also acknowledge Indigenous Elder Jody Sampson. Jody is also on the National Steering Committee, but is currently running programs on Indigenous engagement in the Gulf of Carpentaria, and sends his sincerest apologies for today. And in our Q&A box, we have a couple of questions about First Nation development projects, and that's something that Jody will be speaking of in a webinar that's coming up. Rolf, is there anything, I cut you off before, is there anything that you'd like to add to in terms of service access or of?
No, service access is a problem, and it's partly due to the nature of the neoliberal reorganisation of the state that sort of started in the 90s. So the state is centralised. So for instance, in the Northern Territory, apart from Alice Springs, the rest of the territory suffers a severe deficiency of just about any government service. So this centralisation has disadvantaged local Australia. I mean, you can see it in country towns. In, say you take Canamble, I mean, the government offices, say New South Wales, say bureaucrats that previously lived there now live in Dubbo, and you can replicate that right across rural Australia. So this centralisation of services is a problem. The only way I can see that we can deal with it, because we can't alter, if you like, budgetary constraints, though we could by having a better tax level, but anyway, that's another story, is by outsourcing, if you like, services down to local communities. And I mean, the illustration that Rod gave before about people buying the pub and setting it up, well, I mean, that's a private sector example, but it's an example of where a facility that is needed by the community to maintain the community is controlled and run by the community. And so I think this we'll call it outsourcing for the time being, is the future of service delivery in lowly populated areas.
Thanks, Rolf. Rod, I'd like to bring you back into the conversation. Rod is one of the longest serving members of the SEGRA National Steering Committee, the former Deputy Mayor of Geelong, and an active community leader and innovator, startup business operator, including in the area of telecommunications access. So Rod, talk to us a bit more about where you see telecommunications access going.
Okay, thanks for that, Kate. I'd just like to also bring in here, there's a question raised from Melina right at the beginning of the webinar, and that is the issue of digital inclusion, and I will address that as we go along. I think that for some time, the advocates for a super fast broadband network, not just within major cities, but also in regions, has been a strong push of SEGRA, and we've advocated probably since, well, I'd say the last eight to 10 years, ever since the NBN really got the debate got started, and unfortunately at that time, the importance of fibre and fast broadband connections wasn't really seen, and we saw debates about whether we needed it or we didn't need it, and that's really drifted on for the past 7 or 8 years. Perhaps last year was the real turning point, which COVID brought home to us all the importance of a digital network. And we've seen the people working from home, that's always been an issue. And I think the Victorian Parliament first in 2014 had a parliamentary inquiry into the benefits of telecommuting and the needs of communication systems. A lot of that sat still, and I don't think people fully appreciated the importance. But again, COVID has shown that to be the case, and we've seen working from home become a commonplace. Even today, we've had in Melbourne, there's been reports now that in the age of workers not wanting to go back to the office and they want to continue working from home. And so whilst we've discussed for many years that we'll have 20% of people working from home, it's never really been appreciated until COVID made it a reality. And now, of course, people don't want to go back. And so what we're finding is having that fast internet connection, not just in the centre of cities, but in people's homes. And importantly, I guess in our audience today, we're looking at regional Australia, and it's absolutely critical to the success of a region that we're all connected. We just heard Jen's story this morning. I've actually moved a few Ks down the road to get a good internet connection as well, where we've got fluctuations in existing mobile networks. So I think the last 2 years, particularly the last 12 months, has shown us the importance of it. I think too that we looked before about what makes a region successful, and we talked about the social innovation and locally owned businesses driving opportunity within local communities. And one of the, I guess, the telecommunication services is absolutely critical to that being successful these days, because business just relies about being online, whether it's communicating with customers or your software operation and storage of data, which is increasingly become in the cloud, and it's stored either interstate or overseas. So there's a lot of different opportunities which will be missed out on if we do not have a decent connection in the internet. And I think we've seen the response from local communities to improve that. It's through lobbying, particularly around the NBN, but we're also seeing now local communities setting up their own networks and lobbying to create super fast networks. And we're dealing with one at the moment. I know Benalla are looking at how they can improve their internet network there, and looking at getting high speed, even from 1 gig or up to 10 gig connections. And, at the moment, people are debating within some circles at 25 megs. That's plenty, but this is a new world. That discussion is obsolete now. So I think the implications for the local communities in the regions and the rural around telehealth, we've seen the first real change in policy that's talked about as being temporary, but I believe that will become the norm. During COVID, obviously a lot of people either went online or even on mobile phones to have discussions with doctors and medical professionals. We look at training and development increasingly. Like today, Zoom conference really started because of COVID, and now it's become part of our business model at SEGRA. And so it's extremely important, not just in these types of seminars, but for business rather than jumping on a plane. Many times you'll be able to just have a Zoom conference if you've got proper internet services. So as I mentioned before, business expansion, business operation, it all revolves around having high-speed connections to be able to handle the data that we need. So I think, looking down the track, we've seen governments already move away from face-to-face models, and it's critical now that we have everybody within the community has access to a network. And I think, as Alina raised earlier, pardon me, the digital inclusion, everybody having access is just absolutely critical, and local communities need to look at how that happens. Is it happening or is it not happening? Because that's that people will get cut off from their society and will be excluded. So, you know, whether it's through local library supporting initiatives for independent access, we've seen during COVID various charity groups buying notepads, iPads and SIM cards for people who couldn't afford to do schooling from home because they couldn't afford the internet. So there's local initiatives to help that situation, but I think it needs to be top down. But similar to the business model, things only happen through the actions of local communities. And I just look at what Jen talked about earlier. There's a question that come through, you know, why aren't more people doing it? And I think it really takes local leadership, and that's the opportunity that each of us has in our own area and our own region to lead something, get together with people, like-minded people, and lead a push for whatever the needs that you have in your community. So regional action, regional activity, it's really important.
Thanks, Rod, very much. And Jen, I'll just throw to you again. I'm just very conscious that you're the CEO of a major community service organisation in regional Australia. And so you will have seen the rollout of some of this COVID response. Obviously, access to health has been great, but I think there are some caveats you'd like to put on that. So over to you, Jen.
Thanks, Kate. Well, the first thing I'd say is that everything Rod says is absolutely spot on. A part of digital inclusion, a big part of digital inclusion is addressing digital poverty. And what I'm talking about there is, and Rod touched on it, you know, we, in our response to the pandemic, we did switch to providing some online services via telehealth, etc. For example, family dispute resolution services, which we would normally provide face-to-face, we needed to move some of that online, so that, you know, services for families who are separating. And services around domestic violence. Now, women particularly were at risk because of being in the home with perpetrators, etc., during lockdown. But in terms of digital poverty, we were amazed actually at the number of people who did not have access because they couldn't afford it. And what's important about that is if people are using, you know, mobile devices, etc., many people who kind of live on the edge are forced to have prepaid service, which is a lot more expensive. So it's actually at a premium to those who can actually afford to have a postpaid plan, for example. So even when we were providing services online, sometimes people couldn't access them because they couldn't afford the internet. They couldn't actually afford the internet. So it wasn't necessarily a connection issue. They just couldn't afford it. And what people have been doing is they were using places like McDonald's, etc., for free internet, free Wi-Fi. And of course, when those places closed during lockdown, people had no access. So that also is an issue we need to address, particularly in our, you know, regional Australia, because part of inclusion is about mitigating that digital poverty. The other point I really want to make about services online, etc., is let's not chuck the baby out with the bathwater in regional Australia, because, for example, health and social services are absolutely vital to be maintained in situ. And why that's important is because we cannot lose the effect of positive effects of local knowledge and also of having trained professionals in our communities. We've seen a great hollowing out, as I would call it, over the years of through, you know, decentralisation, and some of that is absolutely rational and logical, etc. However, once a community reaches a a critical mass of what I would call that professional loss, then it's really, really hard to do the things that we've been talking about in terms of social enterprise and, you know, making sure that everybody's taken care of in the community and building that can-do attitude. Now, I'm not saying professionals know it all. Absolutely not. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that you do need a certain cohort of people in our communities who do have skills like being able to speak the funding language, for example, so you can write a community grant to get some startup funding, to do a feasibility study for an energy project, which you know is going to benefit your community, in which some of our participants have already mentioned that whole catch-22 situation of, yep, we've got great projects, they're shovel ready, we know they'll work, but we haven't got any money to do the feasibility study, and by the way, nobody will fund that. So we do need to maintain that cohort of professionals in the community. So let's not move everything to digital, because then, you know, there'll be no argument for not delivering those services from the centre.
Thanks very much, Jen. And look, thank you to everyone who's put things in the chat box and links, etc. Can I encourage any of you who aren't currently on SEGRA LinkedIn to join the group, as many of the people who've chatted online are part of the SEGRA group. So I particularly welcome the Australian Centre for Rural Entrepreneurship, who've put their email address, their website address up there, and they're on SEGRA LinkedIn. Good to post, for you to post on that website what's going on. So our final topic is the capacity to respond to opportunity and unforeseen priorities. And one of the things everyone knows about regional, rural and remote Australia is their capacity to respond, to seize opportunities and to deal with unforeseen priorities. And last year, SEGRA released a special communique as part of our series of conversations on COVID-19, where we noted the number of key strategies that regions could or had undertaken, and all of these remain relevant. And in our next newsletter, I'll put out the link to that, but of course it's on our website as well. So Shani, you've been waiting patiently, and welcome again as one of the new NSC members. Shani is a business advisor at the Calgary Boulder Chamber of Commerce and Industry. She's also the director of the local hub, a business incubator and co-working space, and director of the Dream Big Aboriginal Corporation, and vice chairperson for Goldfields Women Building Business. So Shani, you're a busy lady, but one of the strategies you use, obviously successfully, is to collaborate and facilitate. So a lot of your focus is on collaborating and facilitating for strategic growth and executing projects that add value and significance to the economy of the Goldfield region and wider Western Australia. We've had a couple of questions come in, or comments come in prior to our webinar. And Shani, I know you're going to speak to these, but there are a couple of areas where you have been particularly involved in terms of responding to issues emerging from COVID-19, each of which will resonate with regional Australia. So can you please tell us about these and some policy options you've observed?
Well, thank you, Kate. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for tuning in this morning. I hope to meet you all in person later in the year at our SEGRA conference in Calgary. As Kate mentioned, my name's Shani. I'm a business advisor for the Calgary Boulder Chamber of Commerce. So in my role, I've supported and assisted multiple businesses and community organisations throughout the Goldfields region, and most prominently through the COVID-19 period. By no means has it been easy. Although times have been tough, watching the innovation and the transformation that businesses and community groups have taken to adapt to different circumstances has been nothing short of amazing. Business and industry have increased their resilience, and they've grown immensely throughout this period. But growth has definitely been limited by extreme circumstances. One of these has been the labour shortage. And I know that the Goldfields is not the only region that's been suffering with this. We've had responses this week come in from people in the Pilbara and also areas throughout the Northern Territory and Queensland. Not only are we struggling to fill a skills shortage, but hospitality and entry-level roles such as station hands and fruit pickers and other roles that are often filled by backpackers or people travelling throughout our regions. So changing our visa applications process and the way that our tourists come in to live and work in Australia be altered to extend periods of time spent within a regional location working amongst different industries. What is the answer? We have the jobs, but we don't necessarily have the housing. And I know that this is a huge issue for a lot of regional towns. Some of us are so far remote that it's not a short hour or 2 hours drive to get to work every day. And there's stories that have come in with teachers living in tents. I know last week as a panel we discussed a story about a teacher that was living in a remote area in Queensland, and he had been staying in a tent. So is adequate housing not available? And how can we start to form a solution to attract relocation to the regions? We hear that people are flooding into the regions from our capital cities, and I'm sure that I'm not the only one hearing these stories, but are they really true? And I really feel that we need to be lobbying together to form ideas around affordable housing or housing incentives for our regional remote areas, creating a bridge, encouraging affordable energy within the new housing, creating local small projects in these developments that support our small businesses, in turn create affordable housing solutions, which will long-term support our labour shortage for our regions. Another issue that has been brought to my attention recently has been Australia's trade relations and our ability to export and the need for our products, especially within the agricultural region. It could become a very large problem for us, and this was extremely evident in the Western rock lobster sales in WA at Christmas time. So what is our government doing to protect and sustain our international trade agreements, and is this enough? We really need to ensure that our transfer of markets is facilitated. A question did come through on email this morning that I would like to raise, so thank you to Anne. Anne has raised the issue of community events and the uncertainty of border closures, and the difficulty that community groups are facing with hosting events. There's a lot of fear that if an event is cancelled, the event won't run again. Events are going to be extremely difficult to host, and with the restrictions, they will differ from state to state. However, hosting an event is not impossible. As West Australians, we need to, as Australians, and especially from regions, we need to ensure that we remain resilient. We follow our COVID guidelines and we all work together to have a contingency plan and to think outside the box in case our event is cancelled. Could moving online be the solution? And how can we adapt? So if I can finish on the key topic being that developing key strategic directions that are facing regional, rural and remote Australia and the capacity to respond to opportunity and unforeseen priorities, I just want you to think, what can you do to be outside that box? What can you do to remain resilient? And what can you do to implement innovation within your business or your organisation to get through what is going to be a very tough road ahead? And what can you bring to 2021?
Thank you, Shani. And for those of you who've found that there's been a lot of content, and we've had that comment in the panelists, this is being recorded, so you will have a chance to go back and listen to some of these things. Our final speaker for today is Simon Bowie, ironically our longest standing committee member, so I welcome you last but not least. Simon is currently the Chief of Staff to Madeleine Ogilvie, the independent member for Clark in the House of Assembly in the Parliament of Tasmania. And prior to this, Simon was the Chief Executive Officer for Cherry Growers Australia. He's worked and been involved in community development and regional development since 1981. So I thought a couple of things you might like to comment on Simon, particularly from the Tasmanian perspective, is the fruit pickers shortage and tourism. So welcome, Simon.
Thanks, Kate, and thanks to everyone for the excellent input by the National Steering Committee. In fact, it's made me really think that Tasmania is like a microcosm of a lot of the issues that's happening around Australia. Now, whether it's infrastructure, we talk about hard infrastructure, but sometimes we forget about social and human infrastructure. Innovation, we were cut off basically for 8 months in Tasmania. So there was a lot of really good innovative approaches pushed by government and the community, particularly for online things, selling food, that circular economy stuff, and that's really still resonating now. Like there's a lot of businesses that have really scaled up their economy stuff. You mentioned about tour. I'll start with tourism, Kate. You mentioned with tourism, I said we were basically cut off for 8 months, and the state government, after one of our initiatives, provided tourism vouchers. The way they rolled it out may have not have been the best approach. We tried to do the Icelandic approach where everyone over the age of 18 would get a voucher and could spend it, but they went through a different system. But that really boosted the Tasmanian economy, and I think the figures are actually showing now that during the winter and autumn months in Tasmania, tourism still ran at about 50%. So people were going to their local holiday homes or shacks, and they were really generating the economy, and the momentum actually got a lot of Tasmanians out to where they'd never been before, I suppose. And for my example, I was supposed to go to New York and Hawaii, and I've ended up doing 3 trips in Tasmania. One's the overland track, the walking track, one to King Island, where we went for a holiday, and another one up the west coast of Tasmania. So the government's been very good at encouraging the community to get out and about. So I think that's a really good lesson for all the local communities. I think these sudden border closures can really affect the interstate tourism. Just to give you an example, in Tasmania, when the Queensland and New South Wales had those outbreaks just before Christmas, most tourism businesses in Tasmania lost 30% of their bookings overnight. So that's a huge, huge loss over that key period. In relation to the seasonal workers, I know it's varied around Australia, but in Tasmania, again, the companies that were on the front foot to start off with seem to have been able to weather the storm quite well. And the government here also has been very good at getting people in from Timor-Leste, also from some of the South Pacific islands as well. So our seasonal shortage actually hasn't been too bad at the moment. It may occur in the next couple of months, but again, I think as Shani mentioned about visas and requirements, the government's been very, very good at trying to negotiate longer visas for those seasonal workers. So I think it's a lesson that can be learnt around Australia in those areas where you do require seasonal workers. And there was a huge push here to get school students out, probably from the year 10 onwards, and local people to actually get involved in agriculture. So I started fruit picking, and a lot of people actually being trained up in those particular areas. So it's been very, very effective. And if anyone wants any information, please get in touch with Kate or through me, and I can put you in touch with how they've done the systems here. So.
Look, thanks very much, Simon. And certainly there's been some innovative thinking in terms of visa applications and relooking at that process and requirements, and also to look at industrial relations as it relates to fruit pickers. I've just entered into the chat box a linked a website address that was forwarded to me about the Geotourism National Strategy, and strategic goal 5 is to develop geotourism in regional mining communities with potential geoheritage and cultural heritage sites. And certainly geotourism is always a theme at SEGRA, given people's interest in visiting some of the iconic spots in regional Australia. Well, look, as always, we could talk for a lot longer, but we've run out of time. Thank you to everyone from the National Steering Committee for your participation and your thinking that's gone into this. And thank you to all our listeners and contributors on our chat and Q&A platforms. The next webinar is going to be titled Build Back Better versus Build Back the Same. How will we know our recovery projects are not just repeating the past? This will be a conversation around trends and insights emerging in developing investment attractive recovery projects that enhance local lifestyle and support sustainable employment. It will be in a fortnight's time on the 24th of February at the later time of 12 noon. So 1 o'clock on the East Coast, 11:30 in Northern Territory and 10 a.m. in WA. Also, a final reminder to mark your diaries for SEGRA 2021, 16th to 18th of November in Calgary, Boulder, certainly an iconic destination embedded in Australia's psyche. The webinar today will be available as a video link in the next day or two, and all our videos can be accessed on SEGRA YouTube channel or the SEGRA website. The National Steering Committee will be putting out a special communique as a result of today's webinar, and we'll take on board the chat boxes as well and try and include that stuff. You can also email me at kate@segra.com.au or email me on phone me on 0408 88 2871. Thank you again to the National Steering Committee. They do a wonderful job in terms of bringing together the breadth of issues that impact on regional, rural and remote Australia from such a diverse range of perspectives. So thank you all very much, and thank you for listening.